Thanks, Philip. The brilliance of the first two speakers meant that I ripped up everything I was going to say, I'm afraid. So, and then I scribbled down a load of notes, and I can't read my own writing, so this is going to come out as a sort of random collection of ideas. I just better check the time for how long I've gone for. Right. I suppose I was really interested in that Flint, Michigan story as a sort of MP. Partly because it took me back to Wednesday. Wednesday in Parliament, there was an attempt to get rid of the sitting incumbent Prime Minister, Theresa May. And I was witnessing some of the cautioning language and the anger and the resentment in Parliament. And then in the afternoon, I went down to my constituency. Had two meetings. The first one, which is why I was so taken with this water issue, was around air quality. And we have this issue of an incineration plant, right? Possibly being opened, and a fight against it. And pulled together a load of families just to talk about some of the issues. And very quickly, they weren't about the technicalities around incineration. They were the hopes and aspirations that they wanted for their children. And there was this fantastic conversation about what they thought would be a meaningful life for their children. Very quickly, the policy issue bent into this deeper conversation, which is exactly the point, and forms of agency commensurate with the hopes and ambitions of their children. And the second one was in the evening. We had a vigil for knife crime, right? Because we've had 4 young people under 18 killed very recently in our borough through knife crime, and it was a vigil. And at the end, we had some of our pastors talking about what we was going to do about it. And at the end, it was found expression in them self-identifying next year as a strategy for widening and deepening a project that they classified as a love project in the borough, right? Which I thought was really interesting, because compare and contrast the language that was being deployed for some fundamental questions about life and death, breathing the air, the freedom and life of the children in a local community, versus the coarsening, hardening language in the political domain in terms of trying to get rid of leadership, and the anger and the resentments found expression there. And the contrast of it I thought was absolutely fascinating, and it spoke directly to what you're saying about the question of the Flint, Michigan water thing. And I suppose we all come at these conversations with different backstories and agendas, and it's worth just putting a bit out, because I was taken from Lynn's talk about this sort of hope, despair, dystopia, utopia drumbeat in a lot of this conversation. And I remember it took me back to when we lost I'm a Labour MP, right? And when we lost the 2010 election, and Labour had sort of almost eaten itself for a few years before that, and recapitalised finance, all of this stuff, and arguably at the expense of, and deepened austerity, the early sort of skirmishes around what is a prolonged series of austerity. So it was out of a sense of despair that I sort of saw the 2010 election defeat. And so literally we went and bought a field on an island, right? It's a sort of, the notion of haven is always interested in this conversation around love and politics and hope, utopia. And quickly it can find expression in sort of search for political havens. So literally we went and purchased a field and built a house for 5 years on an island, peering out over to the Atlantic, partly because of I was thinking of getting involved in oceanography rather than politics as a sort of response to some of the experiences. I don't know why I'm talking about this, but it just really interesting, I thought, in terms of some of the points that Lynn was talking about in terms of your own political responses to political failure, economic, social rupture, all of that sort of stuff. Now, I should explain, I am an MP, and in my, I suppose, why I come to this agenda, and I thank Philip Max bringing us together today, because I find this a really, really appealing space to populate, try and nurture, build, talk about. partly because of my experiences as a MP from 2005, where our borough, my constituency, had the biggest expression of far-right activity in the country, right? We had 13 BNP councillors on the borough. We had Nick Griffin standing in, this is 2010 election, and it was the sort of front line in terms of far-right activity. And the anger, the sense of felt humiliation by a lot of my constituents at the political, economic environment they were inhabiting, the sense of hopelessness, that sense of limiting opportunities for mobility, again, returning to the lives that their children could or could not live. What is a good life to live? All found expression in a rage that sort of built up far-right political activity, which I found difficult, obviously difficult, but it's also difficult, friends, neighbours, gravitating to that form of politics as an antidote to what they saw of the injustices of the lives they lived and the political elites that govern them, which was very, very difficult for me. Why they wouldn't gravitate to the left rather than the right is quite a challenging, as we euphemistically say, a challenging thing. And the other thing was, after I come back from Ireland, I was invited to oversee the manifesto process for which worked pretty well until the 2015 election, where again we were smashed at the polls. But the actual process of pulling together a policy review to reimagine social democracy, right? What is its purpose, nature? And I remember we took a load of politicians over to the Tavistock to have a seminar on family relationships, what we would call love. We didn't call it that. The nature of reimagining a modern citizenship through sort of re-establishing a deeper sense of fraternity, I suppose, was the objective. And it was really interesting. I won't go into names, but we had a load of them, all of the shadow cabinet as was then. And the inability for generations of politicians to talk about questions of relationships, family, duties and obligations to one another, I found really interesting, which gets you into questions about how the left get into the situation it is now. So it's the sort of local experiences as an MP, and then the sort of aggregated experiences as dealing with policy formation, manifesto building. This is within the context of a global collapse of social democracy, centre-left politics. Throws up real interesting challenges of the nature of politics, especially on the left. Obviously, they've sort of got jump leads on today as we witness the rise of authoritarian populism across the globe and all of that. But that's sort of reason why I got into this. And I got into this sort of stuff partly because it always, from the experiences on policy making on the left, I always found really interesting this question of how politicians are really at ease with talking about questions of material injustice, right? Economics in effect, distribution of money, maximising welfare, questions of utility, right? Can talk about that to kingdom come. Indeed, they can also talk about questions of freedom and rights as well. But they can't talk about questions of fraternity or virtue or sort of meaning or ethical and moral questions on the left. And I found that really interesting about why that has got to be the state as it is. And I found, looking at some of the New Zealand project and the work that Philip and Matt's done, I found it a really appealing antidote to some of this stagnant forms of social democracy. It's technocratic managerialism, it's remoteness, it's economism, it's instrumentalisation of politics. So that's why I sort of found this a very attractive sort of space to try and work around. Now, so I'm just going through these jumbled notes. Here's a quote, which I always found from Václav Havel. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this sort of conversation the other week. And he expressed it in terms of what he thought were, on the left, three forms of sort of exile, right? One was the sort of personal exile in terms of talking about these sort of things, parts of our imagination. Second was a language that's been exiled from our political discourse. And the third was the loss of philosophical traditions, so the notion of a philosophical exile as well. So, he reminded me actually of a quote from Havel when he was talking about personal exile, which he said in Power and the Powerless, where he said, "We must not be ashamed that we are capable of love, friendship, solidarity, sympathy and tolerance, but just the opposite. We must set these fundamental dimensions of our humanity free from their private exile and accept them as the only genuine starting point of meaningful human community." Seems to me to be a pretty good departure point in terms of the conversation today. The reason why we were talking about this, because obviously we've been discussing Brexit in the last couple of weeks in Parliament, and we were literally talking about this Havel speech because a friend of ours, just before, a few days before the Brexit vote in 2006, Labour MP Joe Cox was assassinated by a far-right activist, a guy called Thomas Mayer. And when he was in court, he shouted at his trial that his name was "Death to Traitors, Freedom for Britain." Right? And I thought, the space between this Havel speech and where we've got to in terms of this guy assassinating a colleague of ours, spoke volumes about the distance between, what we'd strive for and how, into modern day, these might find political expression through the activities of this man, Thomas Mayer. Now, the first point I'll make then, in terms of the politics of love, I've never known the level of personal animus within politics I see now. Right? This is sort of self-evident, but it's worth sort of putting this out there in terms of our conversation. Literally over the last couple of weeks, which goes way beyond established forms of political disagreement, increasingly reflected in personalised language, a hostile undertow to the very nature of politics. Give example. Theresa May, obviously we saw this vote of no confidence in her Wednesday. What they call the European Research Group, the people who organised her vote of no confidence, they organised their activities on the day, right, in a room that they called the kill zone, right? The kill zone. That was the room out of which all their political organisation against their own political leader operated. And I thought that was quite revealing, the sort of language that was being deployed increasingly within political traditions against their own leader. Obviously, that signals a slight decline in levels of empathy and support for one another as colleagues, irrespective of political position. And the flip side of that is almost an escalating level of political certainty, indeed absolutism in politics as well. In terms of almost narcissistic behaviour as well. The Brexit debate is exhibit A in all of that. But it's also not just a political point around the Conservatives, because within my own party, barely a couple of years ago, there was a fairly hostile environment in terms of our own political leader as well. So there's a sort of generic condition of politics, seems to be this ugly anger. Second point to make is there's a bit of a feedback loop from this in terms of how this is played back by the public as we witness a sort of a slow political meltdown, really. Where these are just almost the initial skirmishes, the end of the beginning rather than the end of this Brexit problem, Brexit as symptom, if you want. So we see, for example, email traffic you receive as public officials gets worse and worse. The Joe Cox thing is an extreme, but every MP will talk about violence, especially women MPs, within social media as well. I've been on this is my own personal expression, we was on far-right death lists, jihadist death lists. I had to stop having surgeries because a bloke come at us with knives and screwdriver and and acid. But this is a sort of a signal of the escalating coarsening of our political conversation. Obviously, this is directly related to the question of the politics of love, because this is not exactly the politics of love that we inhabit at present. The third point is also pretty self-evident. As political certainty and absolutism dominate, the question of political absolutism seems to me to be a barely disguised sense of unease and bewilderment that lies beneath it, right? So you have the lack of nuance and complexity is and the advance of this certainty are of a piece. Now, sorry, I'm just going to go back to where I got to on this. Now I've lost my note. Bear with me. Okay. So how do you understand it, right? If these are the symptoms of something deeper, how might we try and understand some of these, the reasons that lie behind some of this stuff? I would say, in terms of understanding what's happening on the right and on the left, a couple of recent essays are really useful in this. In terms of this question of Brexit, English nationalism, there's a really good essay by Fintan O'Toole in Prospect magazine, last week I think, which is, I found really compelling in his study of English nationalism, and almost contrasts it with the evolution of Irish nationalism over the last 100 years, where he says June 2016 it was almost the English equivalent to Easter 1916 for the Irish, right? But one journey since 1916 is a movement from epic dream into complex realities of governing, and you can see that in the evolution of the Irish state and the progressiveness of the Irish state as it deals with some complex modern issues compared to this epic sort of history. And compare that to what he sees as the evolution of English nationalism. He says this: one is a direction from the abstract dream to the complex realities. The other is a journey the other way round with this English nationalism. He says, perhaps this is always so with national revolutions. They are premised on the sacred unity of the people, but have, as a habit, as in Ireland, a tendency to morph into civil war. Right? For our purposes, the dangers lie in how English nationalism deals with the lack of transformation around Brexit and escapes this historic reality. So if you look at modern conservatism, it speaks more of, around Brexit, it speaks more of the French Revolution and the will of the people, rather than sort of classic Burke notion of what conservatism is. So you see what happens when the revolution fails to deliver. Then you have the language of the traitor, the sellout, and it's partly reflected in the language we see politically now. Violence, betrayal. The story of hope and national renewal has bent now into a story of hope, betrayal, the traitor. And you can see it almost on the right of politics, stretching out from the murder of Joe Cox through Tommy Robinson, street protest, embryonic militias, through to dominating part of the character of the main Conservative party in this country now. And that is a very different form of politics than we've seen for a very long time. The other side of the story, it seems to me, on the left, there was an essay by Michael Sandel in Open Democracy a while ago, looking at the rise of authoritarian populism across the globe. Right? And the thesis was a fairly simple one. We should have an economy of outrage and simply protesting and resisting. We should try and understand. And his argument is this basically is symptomatic of a failure of the left because it's lost its ethical grip. Post-war social democracy had an agenda about confronting capital, introducing the welfare state, pushing back against the commodification of our lives, our work, our families, established these havens around the state. Thatcher, Reagan pushed back against that in the late 90s. The third way, near-mitter of Blair, Clinton, Schroeder, blurred the edges but didn't challenge those fundamental reset in terms of neoliberalism, what we now understand as neoliberalism. So consequently, social democracy does not have the resources to challenge and confront since the economic crisis, where it was built around a growth-based, distributional, instrumentalised economics, utility maximisation within the context of positive sum economic environment. When the music stops, when that sort of rewinds, it does not have the resources to confront that. So the point I'm making is, on the left and on the right, I think you can reach an analysis of why we are living in the world we are, and that then turns you to try and understand how, if liberalism, the three creeds that have governed Western market economies for the last 200 years, liberalism, conservatism, socialism or social democracy, as encased in the three political parties in the UK, if they all took a specific bend into neoliberalism, they are corroding. In turn, new ideologies are coming, inhabiting the political environment, often from the margins, are now populating the politics. Authoritarian populism being one, forms of transhumanist thinking being another, actually, but that's a bigger conversation. Forms of nationalism, a sort of retro-leftism at times as well. Is there a case for a new humanism, if you want? And that seems to me to be the really interesting political challenge in terms of a new public philosophy that's needed. That's why I think this agenda, if you want to call it the possibilities, I would call it the possibilities around a new humanism. And I mean humanism in the sense of socialist humanism, for where I'd come from, in terms of its origins as an anti-authoritarian, anti-sort of deterministic, technological deterministic left politics. As in their specific English sense, through William Morris, parts of the New Left. That's where I would imagine this sort of politics possibly taking shape in and around a left politics. Obviously there will be different iterations of different political parties and forms or ideologies, but that's where I think this would go. Now, I've totally lost track of time, but when I started looking at some of this, I was always really taken by a film by Krzysztof Kieślowski, the Polish filmmaker. He did a film called Talking Heads, right? Where he asked people three questions: who are you? Where do you come from? What do you want in your life? Right? And he built this collage of people's responses. It's a fantastic film. And he interviewed people who were born in every year for the 80 or 85 years preceding the year he started. And he filmed this in 1980. It's literally the start of what we now call neoliberalism. Brilliant film. And there's this really warm, humane talk about people's relationships, their fidelities, their commitments, their love and appreciation of one another. It is a really warm, compelling film. Now, you might argue that 35, 38 years on, it would be slightly different if you did the same sort of project. But what do we know about the lives that people wish to live? That seems to me to be a really good starting point. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but that I've got this other project going with a couple of other people, and the idea is a child born tomorrow will live into the next century, right? So can you build a politics around the life that you would imagine that child to live? And then build public policy institutions, and what sort of virtues would you like to nurture in that child for them to live a good, meaningful existence? And based on what we know, almost empirically, from psychology, around what are the lives that people wish to live. Because go back to the first point I made, I think you can understand the present political scene because of the rage and anger about the limitations and the notion that people are unable to live the life they wish to live, or their children to live, and indeed they were promised by generations of politicians. And it's that disconnect that finds expression in rage, humiliation, anger, and almost painful, violent expression at times, which is a very difficult conversation to have, I think, as politicians, right? Because it expresses your own failures, your party's failures. But unless you re-establish a base camp around that dissection of rage and anger, humiliation, and then seek to simultaneously work around an agenda of what would a good, meaningful life be in the modern world, as expressed in the life of a child and then through their life's turning points, you could build a renewed public philosophy, given these exiled traditions that have always sought to understand that in terms of, and indeed the very origins of my party were built around those sort of foundations of the ILP being a classic example. That is a very hopeful thing, which goes back to this question of hope, despair around politics, because to inhabit the political space at the moment is a despairing environment to operate within. But it goes back to something Raymond Williams once said to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing, which is the sort of thing we're at the moment. Anyway, that is a random collection of points I wanted to make in response to the two speeches this morning, but it seems to me that Philip Mack's bringing us together today is about scoping out the possibilities of a politics of love, what I would call a politics of deep empathy, a deep fraternity, that sort of lost part of the liberty, equality, fraternity thing. And it's sort of not just a choice really, it's an obligation amongst us to try, because this is disintegrating in real time around us, politics across the West and indeed other domains, and we better get on with it. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. We have time for some questions before lunch, so yes.
So on Radio 4 the other day, there was James Naughty. James Naughty, I was
but
James Naughty. They actually brought him on as to be interviewed about the current political situation he's in, and he said that the Leviathan Rising was a new political system because this current political system is just not functioning. Do you agree?
Well, it seems to me difficult.
If you do, what can you see? What can you see arising now?
Well, it seems to me it's pretty obvious that liberal democracy is being challenged, should we say, in terms of mainland Europe, the far right on the move, on the streets, inhabiting the parliamentary buildings. They seem
What's
to be.
The solution?
Well, to me, firstly you have to dissect the reasons why, right? On the one hand, the failure of the left and what's happened on the right. Out of that leads you, to me, to think about how you reimagine the very purpose of politics. That's partly why I'm very intrigued about this space, because there's no on-off switch here. You know, this has been decaying, festering, whatever you want to call it, for a very long time, and that's why it means that we have to go to some very difficult, tough conversations about the very purpose of a good life. What is it?
Isn't that actually now a really hopeful time, potentially?
A very hopeful time.
Potentially, because things can change.
Could be. I mean, I get, that's why the contrast to me is really interesting. Just last week, between what people wish locally. Possibly the most deprived part of London. It's the fastest changing community in Britain. Long legacy of far right activity, often violent locally, quite militant, but in the everyday politics around air or their children, people are seeking to push back and contest that terrain in a really hopeful way. But there is no political vocabulary for it in terms of the way it's found expression in the political discourse around Westminster, which is emptying and becoming really quite sort of brittle, should we say. Now that will rinse through, right? I think it's going to get worse and worse for quite a while, but there are grounds for optimism, I think, yeah. But it will be, yeah. I'm sort of hopeful, less optimistic, more hopeful, you know? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that talk, John. Very interesting. I don't like the language of the failure of the left. I think it was the defeat of the left. You know, I think there was an incredibly concerted ideological attack on the left by Thatcher. I mean, the whole spirit of neoliberalism is precisely that, to undo the post-war settlement, to undo the Keynesian settlement. And so I wondered what you think about that, because the point about what happened following the war was, if you think of significant symbolic figures like Richard Titmuss, who said, you know, we must create a respect for public institutions, for public life, and that inequality is corrosive of society generally. Now Thatcher comes in deliberately to turn that language, Thatcher supported by the right-wing media, etc., to turn it around that language and succeeds. And unfortunately, Blair and New Labour didn't attempt that ideological work of turning around the, winner gets all language. So what worries me in talking about humanism is it's slightly too broad and general to think, I want to discuss the public sector and how we bring back the protection of all of us from cradle to grave, which is, rebuilding public institutions and rebuilding public institutions in terms of all the criticisms that was made of their hierarchical and authoritarian nature. What do we call that project, and why are so many people still critical of Keynesianism? Why do they say, well, we can't go back to that? I think we've got to go back to that and more. So I'm going to
I'll tell you what, in response to that, I would say the problem is deeper than a recourse to Keynesianism or a recourse to a renewed sort of welfare economics. It's much more foundational, the problem, in terms of the very nature of a renewed public philosophy for the left. That is how I see it, because, I think it'll get worse next year, actually. Because I think there is this is a very old-fashioned approach to this, I'm afraid, but I think the centre-left is in danger of losing any discernible connection whatsoever to a discernible working class in this country, right? And that will escalate through the process of a second referendum and all the sort of stuff next year. Now, to retrieve that is not a question of policy. It's a much more fundamental question of a sense of the character of the left itself. And that has to be
really. It's a question of policy, though, isn't it? We have to have the right policy.
Sure, we do. Yeah. But I just say sure, policy, sure. But to me, it's a much more fundamental reorientation that's needed, of which Corbyn is part, actually.
I hope so.
Well, it is part, but that is the danger with Corbynism, is that its fractious elements are held together by an imminence around an election. If that is put off, maybe, then there is not a reconciliation or a reckoning within its elements that needs to be done to re-establish a deeper understanding of the purpose of the left. But similarly on the right, by the way, this is not a sort of left-wing conversation, because the debate on the right is even more dangerous, I find. But I take the point, absolutely. A more radical economic policy, absolutely. But I worry that that ain't enough.
Okay, I think we've got time for 3 more questions. So we'll go Paul, then Kim, and then you over there. Okay. So Paul.
Yeah. Thank you. So you say you're doing this kind of relatively, divorced from the obviously political thinking about how you create a new humanism. So I'll use the word fraternity, for want of a better word, though I guess we need one. What would the kind of institutions that would, I guess, have to replace church communities, working men's clubs, unions look like? Is there a vision of that? Because it's that the spaces where, in some sense, the ethical discourse is taking place communally that we really seem to have lost in some profound
Well, I'll go back to see that, like.
So how do we get that?
Well, that's why I go back to some. I could point to scores of local examples of politics being rebuilt outside of the confines of the orthodox, what we understand politics to be. The knife crime thing is really interesting to me in terms of, in East London, there's loads of initiatives around families and knife crime, which are really, and new forms of agency around it, partly digitally inspired as well, actually, new communities being refashioned around threats. And the air quality thing in London, I think, will grow as well around new forms of community politics. Now, that is obviously not the same as church union.
They're not institutions, are they?
No, they're not institutions, but they will be codified within sort of organisations and forms of social movement. Now, that's not sort of 19th century sort of organisational form. But the technological changes will allow them to build mass mobilisation. I think. Now, these are the early doors on all of this sort of stuff, but I think there are some environmental movements and some family-based movements around preserving children that are really interesting around that. I agree. I mean, the easy hit is to say, yeah, but where's the organisational form for this stuff?
I don't mean in quite that kind of way. I mean, people used to know where to go.
Sure.
There was a place that was the obvious place to go.
Sure.
It's that, that could be emergent collective action is one thing.
Give example, right? Give example. We had the far right actually. The people's vote thing is an interesting form of political agency now as well. We get 700,000 people on the streets. We did a local project around building all the faith communities together and a sort of secularised movement around given welfare cuts, how you could rebuild safety nets around socialising children's clothes, food, white goods, and try to build borough-wide initiatives to re-establish floors in the communities. And we've got thousands of people involved. Now, I agree, they are not formally expressed in these organisations yet, but it will be. Now, the real question to me is that if I was going to have a go at me on this, I'd say, well, that's all fine. That's sort of localised. That's sometimes called folk politics, if you want. Given the rampaging nature of the far right and this authoritarianism across the planet, small beer, and it's going to be drowned out by these other movements which are winning everywhere. And that seems to me a much more powerful argument against what I've just said, in that it's just defeatist and small scale given what's happening everywhere else. And that I think is absolutely right. But I also agree that it has not found clarity in terms of organisational form. But look, I mean, my approach to this is I am awash with despair, right, politically despair. I've never had a worse view about the nature and shape of politics. But you have to do something about it, That's literally where I'm at on it, And that's not a good look. And it seems to me that the real thing is to try and diagnose how your own responsibilities or culpabilities in terms of the party, the traditions you are part of, have got us into this place. Because, I mean, what I've found most difficult over the last 10 years is to try and understand the rage that comes at me by people I've known for a very long time and how it is found expression on a far-right politics. And they would find that as a more fraternal politics than anything they've ever seen on the left. And that is the real thing that gets me. So yeah, I'm not here giving it the big one about how things are going to get great, because I don't think they will.
Kim?
John, thank you very much. Can you specifically talk to what Labour is doing in response to what I would think is the single greatest challenge that we face, which is climate change, the actual planet itself, the air, the water, the topsoil, the fact that we consume an agricultural system that eats more in resources than it actually produces. There needs to be a vision put forward that is a political response to climate change that Labour has to articulate. And if Labour and all the other political parties don't, we're probably going to end up in a climate change generated war of the survival of the fittest, which is going to be ugly.
I would say not a lot is Labour doing about it, because the danger is the left of Labour now becomes as utilitarian as the right of Labour, if you want, and preoccupied with forms of growth and economic transaction at the expense of ongoing environmental degradation. And that's always been that's used to be called economism on the left. It's still, and that could well be the dominant form that Labour takes at the moment. And you could probably say that that's why it has little to say about those issues at the present. And but a lot of the momentum, energy, the world transformed. There's a lot of energy there around environmental causes from the grassroots of the parties, generationally as well. And whether that can take on and win some battles around traditional forms of Leninism in the party, that seems to me to be the space to look out for. Because if it can, then that can create all sorts of dynamic political movements and expressions in and around Labour. But if you look at our recent conferences, if you look at some of the policy outcomes, it's difficult to see that that's an imminent victory for those forces. We'll see. The jury's out on that.
There isn't time.
And whether that all finds expression outside of Labour, outside of a formal left parliamentary politics, which is probably likely actually. But again, that's partly because where I sit, it's not the most optimistic about all this. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe it will embed itself more in a Labour representative politics. I hope so. I'll be off on my island by all this time, but
but no one's going to be safe. That's the thing. I mean, it's delusional.
Sure.
It's delusional to think that we're all going to be safe somewhere.
Sure. Yeah. I don't disagree. I'm just trying to look in terms of the state of modern left or Labour politics. I don't think you could say that how that's going to be played out yet. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay, and final question before lunch.
Thank you very much. I found what you said very interesting about materiality, because of course the Keynesian settlement, resource settlement, was built on that. And it still matters, there's no doubt about that. But if you take contemporary politics, and as it is built up to now, the left, so-called, has been, as you just said, primarily focused on the materiality, redistribution and distribution. That's very significant. At best then we have the next sphere, which is respect and recognition, which is what you spoke about for civil and political rights for gay people, whatever, people with disabilities. And we have representational justice. To some degree, I would say, in this jurisdiction, very limited because of the type of parliamentary democracy you have, which is first past the post, which I think is a fundamental problem, because minority interests and very significant interests like environmentalists can actually get a foothold in politics. But I would say the big missing point, which is what you were saying implicitly, I think, is we are relational people. And there is such a thing as relational justice. And people have relational identities. They think of it like, if you read the book Strangers in Their Own Land, about the rise of the Tea Party in the United States, exactly what happened was people were concerned about their local children and their communities. And the right went with their umbrella and they said, come in under our umbrella. We will take you seriously in your fundamentalist Baptist church and you're concerned that your children have nowhere to go and that they don't have a secure future. Because, for wrongly or rightly, I think they heard in their own way something that the so-called, I'm not saying there's a left in America, because there isn't, but I think the left didn't hear, and I think that goes back to gender. Because relational justice matters to women. It matters to children. I've just done a number of studies of people about who people care for, what matters to people.
Right.
And their children matter. Their parents matter. People have relational identities. They don't just have economic, political, or cultural identities. They have relational identities. And I think that because the politics that we have in the public domain has not recognized the relationality and interdependence of the self with the environment, politically and every other way, we haven't seen that side of humanity. And yet, for most people, they don't put on their tombstone, I had a great economic status. They talk about whom they left behind or whom they loved, whom they cared. So that, I think, is the love politics, or care politics. I mean, I think there's a great book by Joan Tronto, A Caring Democracy, which is about bringing that ethic into the public domain. So I just wonder, is that part of your analysis? Because to me that would bring it.
You explained it much better than I did.
Pardon?
You just explained it much better than I did. Well, okay. How do you express, what resources do you have to express what people feel are important in their lives, right? How do you do that in terms of the politics, right? Because that's not in the conversation, is it really? But it is locally, in terms of the water, or you can use. I always found a really interesting example was I used to be involved in a lot of regularisation campaigns for migrants, right? And at the same time, we strangers into citizens, so it's sort of amnesty politics for unregularised migrants, right? And I always used to say that the interesting thing, because political orthodoxy would say, well, you can't do that in your area because your area is the most right-wing, territory. It's the worst environment to do it. Actually, it's quite an easy conversation to have with people about their shared humanity, even in the most wretched political conditions, because people understand those basic sort of relational questions that transcend their physiological characteristics. Actually, you can get into that space, and I actually think that, this is a very difficult conversation. Some of the reasons why the right, certain forms of far right politics, is on the march is, strangely, they have a more appealing, attractive character to people who want some more purpose in the political conversation. Now that is a tough. So like in our area, the BNP would people would find them much more respectful, not in terms of their racial absolutism or anything like that, but in terms of their respect for and appreciation of the sense of personal humiliation that people are experiencing in their everyday lives, economically, in terms of their work, in terms of their frustrations about what the lives their children might live. Now, it bent off into this crazy far-right politics, but there was a sentiment in there that had been lost from the left politics. And that's a very tough conversation to have, but a necessary one. But go back to this, that's why I like this Kieslowski film, in that he literally he asked people what they want in their life. And that seems to me to be a very good base camp for a conversation around this sort of stuff. To try and create a metric around what would be a fulfilled life. Because it taps into deep philosophical questions, obviously, in terms of the nature of justice. But they are exiled philosophical traditions as well. And maybe time to dust them off and reintroduce them. Which I assume is what you're seeking to do.